everybody. Thank you. Wow, what a treat to be here after years of darkness. And we're all back. But it's just wonderful to be here and to talk about this project, which is, even though it came out in 2018, it's still very near and dear to my heart, and kind of working on it in a variety of ways. With the first book, which I wrote on the Inner Mountain West, I got a grant from Francis McAllister of the Flagstaff Arboretum, and the idea was that I would write about the peaks then, and this was 2011 or so, a long time ago, and my intent was to do that, and then as I started looking at the information, it just really lent itself to a bigger conversation about the West. So I just kind of went wide, and that's the Inner Mountain story, which was wonderful in its own way. And it was finally really great, though, to get here and write about the peaks and to begin to see, Jesus, the work that's been done is extraordinary, and nobody had ever, had the time, taken the opportunity to pull it all together. So I was very fortunate, and there were endless, wonderful discoveries that just, the stuff that just makes a project incredible, like learning that there had been glaciers in the peaks was fabulous. I know. So we'll get there. I'll show you the moraines. But I must say, I trained in fairly hardcore ecological science. And yet, when I was working on my doctorate, Dr. Robert Brunig, if you know him, anybody, he used to run the Desert Botanical Garden in Phoenix, and was the director of the museum in northern Arizona for a long time. But he hired me when I was working on science and statistics and all of that to write an article about creosote bush, which I was studying, and to make it accessible to everyone, this different kind of way of writing and thinking about the story. And it was a real deal changer for me. I felt like I really found my voice and my heart, and it's interesting how things happen, and take you in new directions, the right direction or whatever. So anyway, that stuck with me forever, and it's really the way I love to look at science at this point, the telling of these stories and being a bit loose with language or whatever. But so, anyway, so this story is incredible. The building of this mountain is just an amazing sort of thing, and let's see where to begin. It is indeed a sky island. I was very nervous about saying that, which I mentioned to somebody earlier. This isolated mountain with isolated communities that are separated by hundreds and thousands of miles from related populations. They've done a lot of work on sky islands in southern Arizona, and very different system. But I started looking into it, and there are sky islands all over the world, of course, as it turns out. Interesting ones along the equator in Africa, and just all kinds of stories. And it's just another way of thinking about it. And it's all impacted and affected by climate, I mean, a lot of the things that live in the peaks now, the mountain species migrated from as far away as the Arctic to get there, which that was another one of those, wake up to that idea, wow. And now with warming, we're full on Sky Island time, but there are 30 species of plants, high elevation things mainly, that live only in the peaks today in Arizona. So it's a very precious thing, very kind of fragile in a way. So with that in mind, let's get the show on the road. So the book and the story, what I want to talk about tonight is, well, not so much tonight, but the formation of the peaks and the volcanic field which it resides in northern Arizona. It's the youngest geological feature on the Colorado Plateau. There were glaciers and lots of avalanches, and the life zones as described by Miriam, which I'll talk about in a minute, and how they are assorted along the mountain with elevation and all. It is a mountain oasis. It pulls a lot of water in, more than 40 inches a year of precipitation, which includes snow and rain. at the higher elevations. And that's been the average historically, we'll see. But, and then the days ahead, of course. But first, a bit of perspective about where the heck we are, or where it is. And I love this picture. I found it on a USGS map and just had to kind of include it in the story. So North America, you can see the left side of this, the continent is very gray, and that really equates to and is this okay, to deformation. And you can see some of the, let me see if I can get this rolling. Yeah, Basin and Range, those long kind of block faulting things that occur all the way down into Mexico. San Francisco volcanic field right there, kind of in the midst of it, but an extraordinary process. It's like for many years, a long time ago, the Pacific tectonic plates crashed into the western North American coast, compressing the heck out of it, and ultimately subducted under it, which is like kind of wild to imagine, leading to the shallowly, not deep, but just right under the surface, leading to the a rising of the Rockies and other mountains in the region. But this became then, or is, the Western Cordillera. I like to think of it as the Western Plant Highway, because plants have been migrating up and down ever since its formation with climate change. There were at one point deciduous, tropical things way up in the Arctic. And then in the Pleistocene, which we'll talk about a lot tonight, many of the conifers made it way, way down into Mexico, riding the cold. And their story is interesting now. And anyway, so wow, that's kind of how it all got rolling. And it's still going on. So after the compression into the North American plate, the Pacific plate began pulling away and pulling the North American shoreline part of the continent with it, which is what really led to Basin and Range block faulting. They say it stretched the surface of the Earth there so thinly that parts of it just consistently fell through, which is really weird. So anyway, that's the story there, and that is still going on. So, and if you drive down to Tucson, you can see Basin and Range evidence. The Catalina Mountains, for instance, are Basin and Range. But wow, and that has all given rise to this wonderful, wonderful highway. Let's see. And then a slightly closer view. I love these Landsat maps that just strip it all down to the rock. It's just a magical perspective. But you can see a bit more detail of Basin and Range kind of process there and all the way down into Mex. And then here, of course, is the Colorado Plateau, which somehow, and Flagstaff and the Mogollon Rim are right on the southern edge of it, okay? So that's our location there. And somehow managed to avoid most of this quite crazy deformation that occurred. And people are going to be arguing about how that happened forever. I don't know. But, and then the peaks is somewhere right down in there, and the Colorado River there. So anyway, and then a little closer still, there's our mountain, San Francisco Peaks, a stratovolcano, implying that it took multiple volcanic events to create it, unlike a cinder cone, which is, kind of a one-shot deal. These major streams of lava and cinder a mile or more into space. This guy, the dates range from about 2.8 million to 90,000 years ago in terms of the span of its geologic formation. And you can see here Core Ridge, these two lines here, which were major vents in the whole process, central vents that really helped the peaks to go way up high and stuff. Let's see, just for reference, there's Walker Lake, classic cinder cone kind of shape, although that thing is interesting too, it's wet most of the year, and there are actually carnivorous plants in there, which are not found anywhere else in the state as far as I know. Anyway, so that's that, the Inner Basin. That's our mountain, and I think they're like works of art. They're so beautiful, these pictures. So anyway, a lot of the lavas that built the mountain have been dated, which is really nice. And just to point out a few, the oldest known volcano that was a part of building the peaks is called North Sugarloaf, which is the blue guy right there. And the lavas there date to 2.8 million. There may be older ones, older vents that are like buried beneath the lava. Who knows, you know. But that's what's available on the surface anyway. And then handily, right next to it, the kind of orange guy, is Sugarloaf proper. And that erupted about 91,000 years ago. So again, that's the youngest one. And I'll be talking about that a lot. It's just wonderful the stories that it tells. But so, okay, you can see different layers and stuff, and the colors indicate different ages and types. But please note the kind of hot pink one, the polygons of lava that more or less almost make it all the way around the mountain. And that was huge to figure that out, because what it means to geologists is that those lavas were surely distributed by a central tall cone. And much like, you know, Mount Fuji or whatever, which is just wonderful to think about. So, and that was about 500,000 years ago. Those date to about 500,000 years ago. So that's definitely a big part of the story too. So anyway, and it's amazing how far people get without a whole lot of information. I mean, we have satellite, we have all this stuff. In 1910, a guy named H.H. Robinson did a geologic study of the peaks. And he, based on, you know, looking at the basic shape of it and all, this was the shape, this is a projected thing. He concluded that, yeah, it was probably a mountain with a really tall cone, you know. And I mean, in 1910, I don't know what he had to work off of. I guess maybe just the shapes of, you know, the existing peaks and stuff. But so he drew that, suggesting that, you know, might have been the way it looked. And I just sort of messed with this to imagine in downtown Flagstaff what it would be like to look up at the peaks. It would have been closer to 16,000 feet tall, rather than the 12,633 feet, which it's listed as today. And in terms of how this literally went down, it's very controversial, and I want to know. But there's one guy who mapped a lot of the lavas, Richard Holm, who insists that it had to have been a cold debris avalanche, that there was there's no evidence now of pyroclastic or explosive stuff on the mountain, which would have, you know, suggested a major blow up. But there are a lot of other people in USGS volcanologists and NAU folks who think it might well have been a major explosion, and that it would have been bigger than Mount St. Helens, because it's a much bigger mountain. But we don't know yet, and they feel like a lack of evidence of explosive pyroclastic volcanism is not evidence that didn't happen before. So, and this one of my neighbors is a volcanologist who said that, and I'm always nagging her to go out there and look for pyroclastic sort of features. But anyway, it's a wonderful mystery, and in the process of this, one thing I included in the book is a section on Mount St. Helens, because it seemed very germane and just really interesting. And the sort of basic story there is that there was a very snowy mountain, a lot of moisture. There was a collapse, and first, and there were, let's see, there were earthquakes for like a month, you know, at least, just shaking the heck out of the mountain. And then finally a flank of it collapsed, and that released this gaseous, you know, highly compressed situation that created a major explosion, and 250 square miles of dug fir forest absolutely flattened. And so it's hard to say, you know, but it's really interesting to think about. And the recovery there, even with a lot of water, more than here certainly, is hundreds and thousands of years to recreate the forests that were, but great story. So anyway, we don't know, but I'm still holding out that it was a major blow. But, okay, and then a very important part of the development of the peaks is that so much of it did occur during the last ice age, the Pleistocene, which was, I'm not sure the beginning date, it's always changing, somewhere a little more than 2 million years ago to about 12,000 years ago. So this mountain sort of emerged, and its biological communities formed during the Pleistocene largely. And over that millions of years time span, most of the time was very cold, very, very bitter, you know, and glacial, with these weird kind of intermittent warm dry phases that just, it must have been just crazy, you know, that just would drive everything extinct locally or whatever, because it was just so uninhabitable all of a sudden. But all of these species made it there during these cold times. There were corridors created, including along the Magellan Rim, perhaps, and in other ways. But so a long time it was pretty darn cold. And we know about the climate here really well because a guy named Scott Anderson at NAU actually found a lake called Potato Lake, which is about 40 miles from Flagstaff on the edge of the Magellan Rim. And he sank cores into it and was able to collect, you know, everything that had been deposited and keep it in sequence and stuff, and found that between 27,000 and 14,000 years ago, in the last big glacial maximum of the Pleistocene, that all around Flagstaff were spruce forests, and as opposed to ponderosa pine, which is what is very dominant now. So things really changed. Ponderosa pine disappeared through a lot of the West, and spruce occurred all around, you know, coming down from its natural habitats above 10,000 feet in the peaks. So what an incredible time. Everything was on the move, you know. A lot of the conifers, as I said, made it way down into Mexico, and just, you know, probably a lot of things went extinct too, but just a real huge time of just unimaginable change. And I just think that's fabulous. It's just so interesting. And anyway, and today, of course, we're surrounded by ponderosa pine again, and spruce has taken its position along with corkbark fir way up in the mountain these days. So, and the moraines. This was again really exciting. I found this in some magazine, and you know, the search began to find the guy who took the picture, and he, of course, had died. So you know, it's like, but anyway, wow, this is really neat. This is in the Inner Basin of the peaks, looking down from Agassiz, from the western top of, you know, the basin to the east. And the white arrows show some of the moraines. You can see these kind of rounded forms here and there and there and there. And this middle part was referred to as the Core Ridge, from the Core Ridge Glacier. So, okay, let me just back up a bit. So moraines are the debris left behind by expanding glaciers. So the glaciers in the peaks and its headwaters on the west side of the Inner Basin were steep enough to allow ice to form and grind it out and stuff, and gradually grow with lots more snow that condensed into ice. It's like rivers of ice moving, which is, I still can't quite feature that, but that's how it goes in mountain valleys in the world. You know, it just, they get rolling, and there were, okay, this is kind of fun. So there's Sugarloaf Mountain, and North Sugarloaf is over there, and those are the oldest and the youngest known peaks in the, or, you know, volcanoes in the peaks. And as I mentioned, Sugarloaf Mountain was dated at about 91,000 years ago. So it erupted about then. And what's neat is there's evidence of glacial debris along its slopes, and even a little moraine on the north side of it there. So we know that at least 3 glaciers occurred in the Inner Basin after 90,000 years ago. It's like that thing came in first, and then everything slammed up against it. And there were probably many glaciers before that that maybe melted and made it way out into Bonito Park and stuff like that. They think, well, one thought is that before this sucker arose, that glaciers would melt and cruise out to Bonito and all the way to the Little Colorado that way. So there are other stories too. But anyway, so at least 3 glaciers after 90,000 years ago. And the longest one, the Lockett Meadow Glacier, actually made it from the, you know, the top of the Inner Basin through all this stuff all the way to Sugarloaf Mountain. The middle one, the Core Ridge Glacier, made it about halfway down, and it, you can see the debris that it pushed ahead of it, which is what a moraine is. And I hope I'm being clear here, but anyway, it's what do they call it? Unsorted. It's just a big mishmash of silt and boulders and everything, which is kind of unique to moraines, that it doesn't settle out in any way. But, and the Core Ridge moraine here is over 500 feet tall. Just the moraine, the rock leftovers themselves. So wow, you know, imagining a field of ice kind of moving that along is really kind of amazing. And then today they're covered by aspens, which is wonderful. They've managed to hog them for a while, which is really nice. And aspens are a story, of course, unto themselves. This is part of the Core Ridge moraine. You can see how steep it is there, and also how incredibly lush. It's kind of a sediment-limited mountain in a way, you know, so moraines kind of create these wonderful deep soil places. And the aspens come in, and their wonderful understory, which always accompanies them because they're so cool. And anyway, wow. So that's some of that. And then around 12,000 years ago, give or take, the whole thing dried out. And the peaks really became a sky island then. You know, there were no more corridors for high elevation stuff to kind of migrate through or any of that. And all of the way through the Holocene and kind of today, really. But so you can see it really is an isolated kind of form there. Okay, I kind of wanted to swing this. There are so many things to talk about in this, from this research, to talk about some of the people who studied a lot of it in the 1800s and early 1900s. And just, there are four men in particular I kind of wanted to talk a little bit about. It must have been a total blast, frankly. These people, it just must have been a really interesting time to be alive and to come out west and look at stuff. So everybody's probably familiar with Seahart Miriam. He came, I think it was in '96, brought his family out on the train. He'd been kind of with what was becoming the USDA in DC, and ostensibly wanted to study the West to see where people could grow stuff and what might work here or there or whatever. But he really wanted to come to the San Francisco peaks and study the different life zones. That was his bag, and it's called life zone ecology or whatever. But the way that zones are distributed with elevation and also with latitude in North America. And he and his family came in on the train. They camped at a little camp with a perennial spring called Little Spring. It's kind of on the northwest side of the peaks, and it's really quite lovely. And it must have been great. And they went all the way into the canyon and all this and that. But I'm going to go ahead here. Let's see. Okay. Yeah. So he came first and did that, and I'll talk about him again in a minute. And then John Lyberg, and I brought this book, but of course it's in my hotel room, but it's one that I recommend very highly. This guy was from Scandinavia and got here and was going to be a miner, and he started mining in the West in the late 1800s, and became just infatuated with the plants. And also, as he was mining and shifting over to plants, he began to see what was happening in the West, as it was just this frenzy, this big free-for-all, people logging and burning and whatever. Somebody would get a mining permit and would go into an area and just burn it down, you know, old growth forest, whatever, just to kind of see what they were dealing with and what was available and all. They slaughtered animals and, you know, logged stuff, including in the peaks. But anyway, so he was very instrumental in helping to preserve a lot of the ecosystems in the West by making a lot of noise about it. And he married a woman in the 1850s who was a surgeon who worked on the railroads, and people are fascinating. I mean, wow. And then Harold Colton, of course, started the museum, and he did all kinds of things, but also had weather stations all over the mountain, you know, in the early 1900s and all the way out into the high deserts and stuff. And Gustaf Pearson came and led the first U.S. Forest Service research station in the country in Flagstaff, and was the man for the job. I mean, the stuff he found out was amazing. So we'll go on with that then. So anyway, Seahart Miriam and the life zones. This was really interesting to try to put this together. I mean, I certainly honor his efforts, but people have done a lot of work since, you know, and refined the whole notion of what these communities are really like and really about. So I kind of tried to include as much as I could and just make it sort of seem super relevant to today. And we all know the ponderosa pine zone. Let's see, whoops, oh dear, I'm just, okay. Through here, you know, very dry, widely spread species that occurs throughout the western United States with many different races divided up by climate largely. Like the pines on the west coast are very different than those in the interior mountains in terms of drought tolerance and growth rates and all that stuff. Very, very diverse group, really. So anyway, so there's that, and then just up from there is the mixed conifer zone, which includes about 5 species of conifers, and they call it, this occurs on other western mountains too. They call it the sweet spot, the mixed conifer zone, because it has, let's see, how does this go? Frost-free days are a big deal for plants, okay? So the mixed conifer zone, even though it's at a higher elevation than the ponderosa pine zone, has more frost-free days, which is so weird. And then it still gets a lot more precipitation like the zones above it. Just in a nutshell, the reason for this is that on this mountain, which is fairly steep all the way around, at night when the temperature gets colder, it gets bitterly cold at the base in the lowlands all around the mountains. So ponderosa pines have a hard time, but anyway, so this is amazing. And then aspens kind of are, you know, very present with the mixed conifers too, although they kind of hold their own between about 10 and 11,000 feet, pretty much, well, around most of the mountain. And they're amazing too. And that, to me, just had to be presented on its own. So I just took liberties with that. And then, of course, above it, you can see this guy, very uniform and dark, spruce fir forest. Wow, the steepest, coldest ecosystems in North America. And then finally, so this whole thing, you know, if you kind of measure it, it's about over 50,000 acres. And then finally, the tundra zone at the top, above tree line, 1,200 acres, so little, but has the most amazing species. That, again, many are from the Arctic and stuff, so it's a wonderful zone. So Seahart Miriam was very important in kind of getting this stuff going. And then John Lyberg, as I mentioned, came from Sweden and found his way here and became just a huge advocate for public lands, you know, and yay that people did that. He just was like a broken record and stuff. So he saw so much. He saw the Klamath Indians living wild. He got here in 1868 and married a surgeon, reported forest destruction over vast areas from pollution of mining and fires and exploiting animals, and just this major exploitation of resources that we never quite get beyond. Someday. Anyway, so he started writing to all these guys and, you know, complaining about the damage that was being done, this forming public land interested body in DC. And things began to happen. In 1897, Grover Cleveland signed an executive order setting aside 33,000 acres of western lands into reserves, which was like the first step towards public lands, really. And very controversial, even in Flagstaff, because there was one there too, which I'll talk about in a minute, but people were not happy. Anyway, amazing effort, and he saw so much when he came and worked in the peaks, and that's a report that I have from like 1905 or something that I can send to anybody who wants it. It's amazing to read stuff like that, you know. It's sort of like this window into another world, but his perspective on what was happening in the mountain was, to me, more important than anybody else's, really. He really kind of got it. And these were the preserves that were formed. And he was the one who went in and studied most of them, and they were huge studies. So the Peaks, San Francisco Peaks Forest Reserve was founded in 1901. He showed up with his team to do the work. This thing occurred from the south edge of the Grand Canyon all the way into the Verde Valley. So it was quite huge. And they really worked it. He gave the peaks a failing grade because it was being logged to death and grazed to death. I mean, sheep primarily were just driven back and forth all over the place, and logging areas to exhaustion, and then they couldn't figure out why things weren't reestablishing and stuff. So it was pretty wild, and saw, you know, evidence of the big fires that had occurred naturally in the peaks and stuff. But he was very instrumental in bringing about change, and the grazing was unbelievable, totally off the rails. And ironically, the sheep grazed away grasses, and they also grazed seedlings of pines and stuff. But when they got rid of the grasses, they got rid of the mechanism by which fires in the region, which is very fire prone because of the Mogollon Rim and the peaks. But by eliminating grasses, there was nothing to carry these cool, fast-moving ground fires through ecosystems. So it got into these bigger conflagrations, you know, in stands of pines, which we're experiencing today too. this was one fire. This was another photo that was so exciting to find. The upper one here is, this again is the Inner Basin, and looking down towards good old Sugarloaf again. And you can see this is all burned, mostly probably pretty dense spruce and fir forest. This photo was taken, this was interesting, taken in 1910. And people have always suggested that coniferous forests can take many, many, many hundreds of years to replace themselves. Their seeds are wind dispersed. It's just like, you know, when they get there, it's on and stuff like that. But in fact, I sort of hiked up to Agassiz in, I don't know, 2017, and to compare this photo with that. And you can see that in a little more than 100 years, it was really quite, you know, reestablished in many ways. So that was interesting too, that recolonization, even at a southern mountain, can happen pretty darn quickly. And it is indeed, you know, a very fire. This dots represent fires in the peaks between 2005 and 2015. So it was crazy, and I've got other pictures I could show. It just, and it's again, it's because of our monsoon seasons, which we're so lucky to have. And 80% of these fires occur just as monsoons are getting rolling, when there are like dry strikes and stuff like that, you know. So, wow, but wow. So anyway, he did a lot, and he was amazing. And this book, it's called The Doctor and the Dreamer, and I'd be glad to get anybody. It's a fabulous read, actually, about how it went in the West and some of the people who were so instrumental in saving things. Okay, and then Gustaf Pearson, as I said, you know, came, I think, 1901 or so to Flagstaff to do research for the Forest Service, to study the forests around here. And he was also very frustrated with the logging and overgrazing and all of that. But he set up these experiments at Fort Valley, which if you're driving past the peaks and Baderville, it's kind of right on the edge, across from the peaks. And they were like 20-year-long experiments, and he showed how it goes with ponderosa pine in most years. There's typically very little establishment of seedlings, and then, you know, things converge. And a classic example was 1918 was a major crop year for ponderosa pine, and then 1919 was a major rain year, and it rained all the way through April and May into the monsoon season. So, and that's what usually nails the pine seedlings, is that very dry, hot window, you know, between winter and monsoons. But boy, they just kept going. And there were places where, like, it just major colonization event. And all around Flag, there were densities of pine seedlings were like 60,000 to an acre. And this was true actually all over the West. Major process there. But so he did experiments like that, which just revealed so much about the way these things work. And then he was also inspired by Seahart Miriam with the life zone stuff, and took it to another level, literally and figuratively, and established stations in each of the zones all the way to the top of the peaks, had weather systems in place to study evaporation and rain and temperature and everything. I mean, it was incredible, really, what he did. We don't have nearly as good a system in place today. There are like 2 weather stations, but anyway. So he did that too, and even did things like transplanting, you know, Doug fir down low or up high or whatever, stuff like that. And just very visionary and driven and wonderful work. So anyway, just incredible characters that really, okay, I need to get the show on the road here. Okay, so then a bit about the zones themselves. ponderosa pine, an amazing species. And you can see here some of the dog hair thickets, which is exactly how the forests were after that 1918, 1919 event. But there's, ponderosa pine's amazing. As I said, during the Pleistocene, it was absent from a lot of the North America, and they found evidence of some refugio, you know, in southern latitudes in the United States. And then it began migrating back, you know, over the course of 1,000 or 2 years. And that part is really interesting. I met a guy who was a plant geneticist in the Northwest who studied this species in great detail from south of Prescott, going all the way to the Rocky Mountains, and just the rate at which, I got to read this real quick. It's really kind of cool. So let me see if I can pull this one together. Okay, they call them clines. When a species of plant or whatever occurs over a long gradient, things change along the way. And what he found was that, within 10,000 years, it totally just changed genetically all along the way. And from the Bradshaw Mountains in central Arizona, so he did common garden experiments. He pulled plants from all these different populations all the way and grew them in one place under the same conditions, and then could compare growth and stuff like that. And found that 80% of the variation in ponderosa pine growth patterns is due to latitude and elevation. And this, let's see, okay, here we go. He found that through differences among populations going from south to north, there were just this gradual transition of conditions, and populations separated by as little as 700 feet in elevation, which doesn't seem like much, were genetically different from those up the next stack. And they're just, it's like this almost seamless thing. You can't just say, okay, this is one species or race and that's another. But it was just such an incredibly gradual transition, so sensitive to the details of the environment that it's incredible stuff. Anyway, so I thought that was pretty interesting. Just how fine-tuned these changes, these responses to an environment can be along a gradient like that. Just unimaginable, just so tight and stuff. So anyway, it's amazing. I think the oldest plant, oldest pine in the peaks is over 400 years old, which is pretty good. Dog hair thickets, yeah. There's been great research too. They studied at NAU and other schools what they call pre-settlement conditions for ponderosa pines, and found that there were fires consistently, and most populations were probably fairly open, multiple age, and surrounded by big expanses of grasslands. Very healthy systems. Mutton grass is one of the main grasses associated with it, along with blue grama grass. They're wonderful species. Okay. And then moving right along. Okay, and then the mixed conifer zone, again, as I said, this is the sweet spot, and all these species have wonderful stories. Doug fir, everybody knows that, white fir, blue spruce, and then southwestern white pine and limber pine are very closely related, and they're being studied now. I interviewed a woman whose name is also Waring at NAU who's studying them, and it was all kind of blowing up at one point, the genetics of them. And what happens is that southwestern white pine occurs on the southern part of the United States, and limber pine occurs further north, way up into the Rockies, and they kind of meet in the peaks and at other similar latitudes and elevations through New Mexico and hybridize like mad. And it's just another way of kind of working it, keeping the species viable in times of climate change and all that. And we'll see where that all ends up. That was a pretty interesting story. I know this woman was like, wow, I don't know. That's part of the process. Anyway, and then aspens, of course, 85. I had that wrong, to 10,000 feet. Everybody knows aspens, right? Clonal, the most widely distributed tree in North America. And it has a counterpart in Eurasia, and they hybridize. So it's probably the most widely distributed tree in the world, really. But the clonality is amazing. So it can come in after fires really quickly, like in a week or two. Whereas again, the conifers have to kind of fly in whenever they get there. They truly, they're next to riparian habitat in the West. They're thought to be about the most important ecologically because they support so many other plants and animals. And part of that is because, like other members of the willow family, which this is in, which includes cottonwoods and willows and stuff like that, they're all very fast growing, very productive. And that's kind of a resource in itself. But they also, their wood is very soft. Their leaves are full of water. So when everything falls to the ground, it gets recycled pretty quickly, creating these wonderful habitats for all kinds of understory species as well as animals. And they photosynthesize through their bark, particularly in the winter and on south-facing stems, which is very smart, that economy of nature stuff, and all of that. And yeah, amazing species. And they're really struggling here, in the peaks. They're very heavily attacked by elk and stuff. But also, I mean, they migrated down with the cold too, so they may be heading back. But then another one real quick is, we're getting there, but this pea, this wonderful ground cover species, Lathyrus, I love that name. Nevada pea, though, fixes nitrogen like so many legumes do, and is very important on a lot of southwestern volcanic mountains for helping to provide nutrients, i.e. nitrogen and stuff in these nitrogen sort of limited systems. And they play a big role too, and they're very widely spread through most of the zones there. And then the spruce fir zone, of course, very steep, and extensions really of the boreal forests of Canada and further north in North America. Just here in the Appalachian Mountains, they send down spruce and fir species that are typically different than what occurs there, but like our Engelmann spruce. I don't think it occurs in the boreal forest, but something very closely related to it does. These are the coldest habitats for forests and also the steepest, clearly. Except like in places like the Inner Basin, if you've all been there, where it's just this wonderful corridor and where there are meadows. You can kind of see everything, spruce and fir, pretty straight and narrow and dark, and aspen kind of coming in where it can, and then these wonderful meadows, and there's old Engelmann spruce there. Beautiful trees. Again, this guy or something very closely related to it made it way into Mexico, which is kind of fun. Corkbark fir is the major fir in the peaks, and it has one of the smallest distributions of all the conifers in the Southwest. Very tiny and very poorly understood, and I would love to see that studied. There are 5 species of orchids in the peaks, and this guy is really lovely. It occurs along the edges sometimes, and Arizona fescue is a major grass in the system. And then up at the top of that, not quite tundra, but is bristlecone pine, and it's like we all know those from the Rockies and the Great Basin, where they grow to be 5,000 years old or whatever. And this guy was on top of Core Ridge, one of those necks I referred to early on, the major volcanic vents, at 11,500 feet, and which is about tree line, and looking rather windswept. But they have been dated in this area of the peaks at over 1,500 years old, with dead stems cross-dating back to 2,500 years old. And they're really amazing. But right now they're spreading down the mountain, and nobody really understands why. But like this guy was in the Inner Basin and looking very different than that. So that's another mystery. And the same on Hart Prairie, if you're familiar with that area, with growth bands that are just massive. So a lot of that is probably cessation of fire, that everything's been able to migrate down more, which, unlike Seahart Miriam, who said temperature regulates all of it, a lot of things were probably limited in moving down very far because there used to be fires all the time. So anyway, good deal for them. So anyway, and then on to above tree line, the tundra, which they go, stuff grows all the way to the top there, and it is harsh and fabulous. And there are two kind of major habitats, these fell fields, this stuff, it's just utterly unstable. Somehow things, hook in under a rock or whatever, and we're off. But, and then there are some, very few, but alpine meadows, such as this guy here. You can see a little water and a snow melt kind of, or snow field kind of still melting there. So they're pretty lush. And this is really, these kind of habitats where the greatest diversity of species occur up there for sure. But anyway, and just a little side note here, I mentioned that the weather stations are very limited in the peaks. And this guy, this is again what makes me think this would have been a really fun time to be alive. That was like early 1900s, and this guy's name was Frederick Colville. And he was in DC encouraging Liefeld to study stuff. They were all connected, Miriam and Liefeld and this guy. And these guys, though, in the early 1900s on a lark, just schlepped all this weather stuff up to the top of Agassiz, which was over 12,000 feet. And for, I think, 2 weeks, let me find this, for 2 weeks measured temperatures right down on the ground and then like a foot or so above, just to see what was going on. And let's find that. Yeah, okay, what luck. I have the only published temperature measure for the Peaks Tundra Zone. That's pathetic. I'm sorry, it's still true. But anyway, from, 1898 in August, 2 scientists with the Carnegie Institute studying southwestern deserts decided to spend several weeks studying temperature on the top of Agassiz, sure. But I could just see it now, and they measured temperature at 12,356 feet and shed light on why living low to the ground above tree line is the way to go. First, they found that air temperatures above tree line did not vary as much as daily temperatures, at lower elevations. It's just plain cold above tree line. Then they found that the ground was much warmer, of course, than the air temperature. On August 4th, at 4 p.m., the soil temperature was 76 degrees, and the air temperature was 57. And then at night, in the morning at 7 a.m., soil was 48 degrees, and air temperature was 21 degrees. So even though it fluctuated, 48 degrees, that's okay. So, wow, but it must have been really fun, a different world with just lots of possibilities to do stuff like that. Anyway, and some of the flowers, there are many, many flowers associated with the tundra here, and most of them on the peaks occur only on the peaks in Arizona. So they're the ones that are from the Rockies and further north. Some of them, like the little moss campion here, this guy, which I love. It's like this this doll. It's really little. They're so cute, you know, and they make these little gardens, and it's just wonderful. But that thing is circumboreal. I mean, it occurs all along mountains and stuff, and then just, you know, in tundra above, at the top of the world. Yeah, and then this guy, Perry's primrose, is one of the taller ones up there in wetter canyons and stuff at the top. And there are a bunch of related species close to it that occur, you know, separated in little ranges throughout the West. So they all have these amazing stories. This guy is endemic to the peaks, San Francisco. Anyway, it's a sunflower. Ragwort, okay. This guy, another one, cracks in the rocks, and then GM rossii also occurs all along the top of the world too. And it's just wonderful to go up there and see all this stuff, you know. You can't help but really like it a lot. Okay, rolling right along, and then a few animals. This guy was found at 10,000 feet. This is the American pipit, which flies in from the Rockies to breed in the tundra and the peaks. I mean, how would it even know it was there? You know, that's incredible. I mean, this little spire, anyway, it's amazing. And then this guy, everybody knows Clark's nutcracker, a jay, is very common in the peaks. And this guy and this red squirrel are fierce competitors for limber pine and southwestern white pine seeds, and form territories and are just totally hoggish and stuff, but pretty interesting sort of challenges there. And then wonderful predatory birds. Mountain lions were at one time collared in a study by the USGS in the peaks, and some of them have ranges that encompass the whole mountain. And there are many, many things that are very locally distributed butterflies that might occur on the peaks and another mountain or two and nowhere else. And then this guy, a golden mantle ground squirrel, they occur up in the tundra where people hike and are quite chunky as a result of that. It's kind of fun. So it's a good gig, good work if you can get it. Okay, so Harold Colton, in addition to starting the museum and, you know, supporting Native American studies and all kinds of stuff, did this wonderful water study. And you can see, this was, let me see, I'm not sure. Oh, well, he published it in 1958. I think it was earlier than that. But you can see these little thingies here which show where all of his weather stations were. Very rudimentary, but he would like slog up into the Inner Basin in the snow, you know, all winter long to measure stuff and stuff. And then here, of course, all this to the northeast it's rain shadow, and he found much lower precipitation, partly rain shadow, partly that it's much lower elevation and stuff. But he did a lot, you know. He did a lot for the region. And then this is, just to talk a little bit about water, this graph put together by a guy named Don Bills, who was at the USGS in Flagstaff, just showing the distribution of water in what they call, I guess this is called the Coconino Plateau, which I don't know, but from the Grand Canyon into the Verde. And you can see where it's really green or blue or purple, that's where the moisture is. And the basis for that is the Mogollon Rim itself. All the weather people I talked to, I was like, well, isn't the peaks important too? You know, and they're like, no. I won't tell you how they described it. It was really rude, but they suggested that the Mogollon Rim was the whole deal, you know, that's what really, with its orographic feature that's thousands of feet high, just, you know, these weather patterns from the Gulfs and the lower Pacific come in, you know, are heated by the desert and then slam into this wall, and then up they go, and there comes the moisture, you know. But I still think there's, you know, the peaks are important. they, you know, pull a lot of water, and even like Bill Williams, Sitgreaves, and Kendrick all get over, or have historically on average gotten over 30 inches of precip a year. So there's a lot kind of pulling it in. It's a good place to be, I think. Climate maps that I see these days show the Mogollon Rim is looking pretty green. So might be something to think about, living near an orographic feature for water and stuff. But, okay, and just another, I had a lot of help with the data. The weather data, the precip data for the peaks are these disparate little weird data sets, so we just did the best we could to try to show what's going on. So over the course of about, 65 years, this is just snowpack, which is half of the precip thing, or a part of it anyway, just to show that as you climb in elevation, here from like Flagstaff, which averages around 23, all the way up, you know, way up on the peaks, 180 inches a year on average, and that's changing. Very quickly, but just to show what an oasis it can be, you know, and pulls a lot of water. It's a fractious enough mountain that what isn't drawn off through sublimation and evaporation and being drawn by the city to Flagstaff goes down into the aquifer below. So there are very few, you know, perennial streams or any of that stuff because of that. And it is changing, and all of the statistics are significant now for, you know, increasing maximum temperatures and minimum temperatures and averages. So it's happening, and it's incredible to see stuff come up and turn green anyway. It blows my mind these days. And, you know, the challenges are certainly there, and we all know that. Okay, yeah, wow. This was interesting, driving up 180 one day. Elk, a picture says a million words, certainly in this case. But you can see that what the elk do, which were here originally, then driven to extirpation or whatever, and then reintroduced near Williams finally, and obviously it worked because they're all over the place now, but they love to browse the stems of aspens and also rub their antlers on them and stuff like that. And it's a big deal, you know, what's happening there, and we'll see how that one plays out. And you know, conifers and aspens have always had a pretty tight relationship, you know. Conifers will come up over top, there will be a fire, the aspens are back on the boards, and then it's just this very, you know, oscillating sort of thing forever. Anyway, fires are amazing. This was the Schultz fire, 2010, 14,000 acres in one day. Whoa, but it sure was pretty. Kind of. Yeah, biggie, wow, just, and that's what it looks like now, although things are starting to come back a little bit. And then, I used to bike up along the peaks forever. You know, I still do, but you know, and see this shrub, which is bitter choke cherry, occurring just along the margins of the roads in this densely forested, you know, slope area. And they never bloomed or anything, and I was like, wow, what is with this existence of just occurring along the edge of a forest and just barely hanging on? And they were just waiting for their turn. So they've spread widely throughout this burn area and are helping to hold a lot of the soil in place on these very steep slopes, and aspens as well. So that's kind of wonderful. And it's just this endless cycle. So anyway, it's a young mountain, relatively speaking, and with a lot of, you know, animals that totally depend on its high elevation, coolness and moisture and all, and still a lot more to learn. So anyway, that's all I've got. So.